Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here. Thanks for checking into my YouTube channel. If you're following along at all with our sermons at Gospel Fellowship PCA, you probably already know that we're working through the book of Isaiah, that great gospel preaching prophet of the Old Testament, and we're going to be there for several more months. And recently I came to a very interesting text indeed, Isaiah chapter 14, which contains a very unusual reference to the king of Babylon that many people have actually interpreted as the fall of Satan. You may already know this passage, Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 to 15. A number of interpreters have associated this in some way with the fall of Satan. So I thought I would break this out of the sermon and put it into a special video in and of itself so we could talk about this. Now, obviously, we all know that Satan fell. Jesus says so. Jesus says so in Luke chapter 10, verse 18, that he saw Satan fall like lightning. Of course, Christ, the pre-existent Holy One, the Son of God, is eternal. And so he has seen all things throughout redemption history, including the fall of the devil. And nobody really disputes that the devil and his angels fell from glory, a position of goodness or righteousness at some point in history. We just don't know much about it, when it happened or how it took place. There are a couple of questions in the Westminster Larger Catechism that attempt to describe this. They describe the angels as sort of like men in the sense that they have a will and can fall from their nature and from their state. And so we know that Satan fell, and I don't think anybody really disputes that. The question in this study, though, is does Isaiah 14, 12 to 15 describe that fall? Or is that a little bit of a colorful and fanciful interpretation of a passage that otherwise is in context about the king of Babylon, who would either be Nebuchadnezzar or perhaps another? There's also some associations that some commentators make with the king of Babylon being the king of Assyria. I know that doesn't seem to make sense on the surface, but remember, in the 700s BC, when Isaiah is prophesying, Babylon is a city and Assyria is the global empire, which has control over the city of Babylon. So some people have suggested maybe this is describing Sennacherib or Sargon or some other king of either Assyria or Babylon, respectively. Although most scholars say that in direct context, we're referring to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Now, just for fun, as I was preparing my sermon, I went to basically all the study Bibles I have, and not yet the technical commentaries, because I want to see, what do the people believe? What are people hearing about in their Bible studies and their fellowship groups and their home groups and their personal devotions? And so I got out all of my study Bibles, and the general consensus in about half of the study Bibles is that they explicitly make the connection between Isaiah 14, 12 to 15 as referring to the fall of the devil. That's right, the devil. And the other half of my study Bibles at least made that connection implicitly, suggesting that most people who are reading from study Bibles made for general audiences are in their minds connecting this passage in some way or other to Satan. And what I would like to do in this video is get into the topic and see what we come up with if we were actually to do some research of this passage in context. So if you're just joining me today, my name is Matt Everhart. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship Presbyterian Church, PCA. We are situated just north of Pittsburgh. If you're anywhere near the north side of the city, the Steel City, come visit us, Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are open, by the way. We have worship services 8:30 and 11 and 6 o'clock p.m. So we'd love to have you. Again, we're a Bible-believing church, love Jesus, on a mission to share the gospel with the world. So let's return to the state of the question here and get ourselves situated. The question that we are redressing today is, does this particular passage refer to the fall of the devil, or is it merely contextually moored to the particular political situation that Isaiah is addressing in Isaiah chapter 14? In other words, is it really related historically just to the fall of the king of Babylon? Now let's do a little bit of homework here and just recover the basic situation of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophet to the southern kingdom of Judah, for the most part, in and surrounding the area of Jerusalem. Of course, by this time, Israel has long since split into two nations with their own kings. There's Israel in the north with its capital of Samaria, and there's Judah in the south with its capital of Jerusalem. And the world power, the global power on the scene is not yet Babylon. Babylon's not going to be in power until the 500s BC, or at least as a threat to the southern kingdom of Judah. But momentarily in the mid-700s, 734 BC, something like that, the real global power is Assyria. Assyria is encroaching dangerously. In fact, Israel in the north has made a political alliance with Syria, not to be confused with Assyria. I know that's confusing. Sometimes that nation is called Aram, and so Israel has made a political pact with Syria, hopefully to avoid being conquered by Assyria, and unfortunately that is going to happen to the northern kingdom. They're going to be destroyed in 722 BC at the hands of the nation of Assyria. The southern kingdom of Judah is not going to fall until 586 BC, at which point they will fall to Babylon. So, if Isaiah is talking to the current situation in the 700s, then probably he's referring in context to the king of Assyria. Remember, Assyria has control of Babylon. If, however, this is a future prophecy, and there's nothing wrong with that. Isaiah is a supernatural book. In fact, he names Cyrus by name hundreds of years before he lives, so we have no problem with it being a supernatural predictive prophecy. But if this particular passage is so, then he is referring to something that happens several generations after his own lifetime. Now, let's survey the theological scene just for a moment. Which biblical commentators and theologians would hold that Isaiah 14:12 to 15 refers directly to Satan? Well, this interpretation is actually quite old, and going all the way back to the very early Christian church, we have theologians like Tertullian, theologians like Origen, and even the great St. Augustine himself made connections between this passage and the devil. And after all, it does make some sense. I mean, let's at least give the argument some due here. First of all, there's no description of how the devil fell in the book of Genesis. And because there's no blow-by-blow description of Satan's fall in the book of Genesis where we think it might have most naturally laid, that inspires a little bit of curiosity on the part of biblical scholars and theologians. We want to find out how this happened. When we go back to the book of Genesis in the early chapters, we see, of course, God creating the world in glory, with his power, in 6 days and resting on the seventh. And virtually the next scene, Adam and Eve are being tempted in the garden immediately after God makes for Adam a helpmeet in Eve. But by the time Adam is working in the garden, Satan, in the form of the serpent, is just there. He's already there, tempting Adam and Eve to fall. And so the question that plagues the mind of many is, how did this happen? How did Satan fall? When did it take place? Again, Jesus says he saw it in Luke chapter 10, verse 18. He saw Satan fall. But there's not much there as far as how this happened. And not only that, but that puts us in a little bit of a difficult place theologically, because why would a good God put an evil, tempting serpent in his garden? And so there's sort of some moral overtones to this question as well. And that, of course, leads to the speculation that perhaps a passage like this one might provide a suitable interpretation as to how it is that Satan fell. And when we read the passage, I think you're going to see why that explanation is at least plausible. Now, not only that, but you probably know, if you've been following this channel, that I'm a Jonathan Edwards scholar. I devoted a lot of my life to studying, reading him, and writing about him. And Edwards does come to this conclusion as well. If you're interested, you can read Miscellanies 340 and 1264, I think it is. Those are a couple places where Edwards associates this particular passage, Isaiah 14, with the fall of the devil and his pride. So you might want to look that up yourself. However, and this is where it gets really interesting for those of us who are Reformed and our theology, John Calvin despises that interpretation. In fact, he thinks it's a gross error and a superstitious interpretation of Isaiah chapter 14. And if you want to read Calvin's opinion, he's an obvious no when it comes to connecting this passage to the fall of Satan. Just go to his commentaries. They're available online. You can read them for free. And just go to this exact chapter, Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 to 15, and look at what Calvin has to say about this possible interpretation. Let me just give you a little bit of it because I happen to have it in my hand right here. He says, the exposition of this passage, which some have given as if it referred to Satan, has arisen from ignorance, he goes on. For the context plainly shows that these statements must be understood in reference to the king of the Babylonians. But when passages of Scripture are taken at random, you can see that he doesn't like this interpretation, and no attention is paid to the context, we need to wonder that mistakes of this kind frequently arise. Yet, it was an instance of very gross ignorance to imagine that Lucifer is the king of the devils, still quoting here, and that the prophet gave him this name. But as these inventions have no probability whatever, let us pass them by as useless fables. Well, how do you like that? All right, so not a lot of study Bibles call this a useless fable. In fact, if you were in a Bible study and somebody called this a useless fable interpretation, you might wonder if this person were not some sort of a liberal, trying to de-supernaturalize the Bible or something like that. But I don't think that's what's happening here. So let's read the passage and let's see if we can't give an explanation to it. So here it is, Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 to 15. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. And so goes the interpretation that at some point in primordial history, before the Garden of Eden scene where Adam is tempted, Satan says to himself, I am going to be like God. I want to be like the Most High. Notice he doesn't say, I'm going to be greater than God, because that's, of course, impossible. Nobody can be greater than God. But according to this reading, at least, Satan says to himself, I'm going to set myself on an equal throne with God. I will ascend to the heights. I'm going to make myself like the Most High. And then apparently in judgment in verse 15, God says, but no, you will be brought down to Sheol. And at this point, as the interpretation goes, God casts Satan down and judges him for his pride. And all of that makes perfect sense. It seems like that would be a good explanation for how it is the devil fell. The interpretation certainly puts the fault of his fall not in God's creative goodness, but rather in Satan's pride and in his willfulness. And so that would seem to make sense. That's even a consistent reading with what the Westminster Larger Catechism says about the fall of the angels. I believe it's questions 16 and 19 in the Larger Catechism. You can look that up for yourself. I probably should have checked that before I went on the air. Now, okay, so we have the King James Version then, and I just read the English Standard Version of this text. And the King James Version certainly lends towards this interpretation, and I'll tell you why. Because in that venerable, beautiful, and excellent translation that the King James Version is, it translates it slightly different, and listen for that difference right here as I read just verse 12. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? Okay, so there again, Satan's influence upon the nations to weaken them and to destroy them. But notice that the King James Version uses the name Lucifer. And of course, if you are reading from the King James Version, you come across this verse, you're going to make that connection in your mind between Lucifer and Satan, because we've been told that. I've been told that. I've seen that in systematic theology textbooks, that Lucifer is one of the proper names for the devil himself. If I asked you who Lucifer was, you'd say it was the devil. If I asked you what the devil's name was, you'd say it was Lucifer. And so this connection has been going on and on for quite some time. But, and my King James onlyist viewers will about to go crazy here in the comments, the King James is a translation, and it's translated upon the Hebrew. And I'm going to go ahead and argue here that if we have any sort of difficulties, it might be good for us to actually consult the original languages, right? I mean, is the name Lucifer there in the text of the Hebrew? Actually, what we find is that the King James Version, translated in 1611, is a carryover in this verse from the translation that preceded it, which is to say that great translation called the Latin Vulgate. Now, many Protestants are known to have beat up on the Latin Vulgate because in certain places it's not a helpful translation. And in some places it has even furthered Roman Catholic medieval theology in its inaccuracies. And so a lot of Protestants have been quick to decry the Vulgate as somehow a lesser or corrupt translation. The fact of the matter is, though, that for over 1,000 years, the Vulgate translation was the best thing going, especially in the Latin-speaking world. And for all other intents and purposes, it's a fairly excellent translation of the Greek and the Hebrew into the Latin. But you're going to see in the Latin Vulgate where the King James Version gets the word Lucifer from. They simply lifted it from the translation that the King James translators were working from in the Vulgate. Of course, they had Greek and Hebrew copies in front of them. I know that, so you don't need to add that in the comments. But they certainly worked on and from other translations as well as helpers. And the Latin translation was the main translation for years and years. And so they consulted it here in this verse. And they picked out the word Lucifer and they carried it over into the King James. But Lucifer is actually a Latin word, and it simply means light bearer. It's not explicitly a proper name in context in the Latin Vulgate of Isaiah 14:12. It's simply a literal translation of the Hebrew word that underlies it. And so Lucifer, literally in the Latin, simply means one who gives light. And that, my friend, is going to lead us to the next thing we need to do, which is go all the way back to the Hebrew, the original language of the prophet Isaiah. And here in Isaiah 14:12, what we see is the Hebrew underlying the Latin Vulgate translation of Lucifer is the following phrase, Hallel ben Shakar. Hallel ben Shakar, and my pardons or apologies for mispronunciation. The Hebrew literally means this, shining one, son of the morning. Shining one, son of the morning. And so you can see where the Latin would translate shining one as Lucifer. After all, what does Lucifer mean? What's the root word there? It's light. Okay, so if you speak Spanish or any of the other Romantic languages, you probably know that luz, L-U-C, means light when translated into English. And so Lucifer in Latin is a perfectly able translation of the Hebrew shining one, son of the morning. Now, what in the world is the shining one, the son of the morning? Well, to get down to the very image itself here, what we have is a metaphor. And of course, interpreting the Bible, we have to be constantly looking for metaphors, for imagery, for other literary devices here. And the shining one, the son of the morning, in the ancient world is actually the planet Venus. That's its nickname. It's not really a star, although they didn't understand necessarily the difference between stars and planets in those days. But the shining one, the son of the morning, is Venus, because if you were to go out on a nice clear morning when it's still dark before the sun has risen, the brightest object in the sky, if you're not looking at the moon, of course, is going to be the planet Venus. It is the bright object in the celestial orbit in the morning and the darkest hours. And what happens to Venus as the sun comes up is it is immediately overshone. It is completely overwhelmed and deluged by the greater light, which is the sun, because it's only the son of the morning. It only rules in this temporary time. In the darkest of times, before the great light of the sun comes up. And so what Isaiah is actually doing here in the original context is he is mockingly or tauntingly calling the king of Babylon the morning star, or the son of the morning, the shining one in the morning. And now, when we draw this back into the original context in which Isaiah spoke, it all begins to make sense. Because Nebuchadnezzar is the evil king in the time of great darkness, right? And so he is shining brightly for a moment, but that's exactly where this piece of imagery comes in with full power, as though Nebuchadnezzar appears to have the moments, though he appears to be the shining one for the time being. As soon as the sun, or the greater light of the gospel, comes up, he's going to be immediately deluged by a greater light, and his time of darkness is instead going to be replaced by a greater time of light and glory. And so Isaiah's main point in context is that evil will last for a short time. Evil will have the power of the darkness for a short time. It will appear to be glorious and great, like the king of Babylon or Nebuchadnezzar was. But, praise be to God, those dark powers are going to be overwhelmed when the fuller light of the gospel is manifest. And so, Calvin seems to have a pretty strong point here, that if you take this passage in its original context, this is a taunt towards the king of Babylon. In fact, the passage even calls itself a taunt, or the oracle passages of Isaiah in chapters 13 to 23, are when Isaiah takes his attention and he begins to turn them to the pagan nations surrounding the people of God. The pagan nations are going to appear as though they're powerful for a moment, but they are going to eventually be overthrown. Isaiah will have us to know over and over again that whatever powers of darkness would seem to have sway in the moment, yet the remnant people of God will continue to survive. God will preserve for himself a remnant. That's the point of Isaiah chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. And when the full light of the kingdom comes about in the gospel of Jesus Christ, of course, it will be a much more glorious and a bright day and time in redemption history. So then what do we do with the day star, with Lucifer? Well, I would suggest this. I'm not ready to completely abandon the idea that this passage may have something to do with Satan, but clearly it's not what Isaiah was describing literally in context. In context, it is the king of Babylon. However, let me make one big caveat before we close down this Bible study this afternoon. In the Old Testament, we have a major interpretive grid that we call typology. And as you mature in your Christian interpretation of the Old Testament, one of the things that you're going to begin to see is that there are more and more types in the Old Testament that are fulfilled in the glory of the New Testament. Now, let me quickly define what a type is in the Old Testament. A type is a literal person, place, thing, or event that finds a greater significance and a greater importance than its own self as redemption history unfolds, especially as the gospel comes into more and more clarity. Let me give you a couple examples here. This is going to make sense, I promise. So in Noah's day, the flood itself was a type of the greater judgment that is eventually going to come on the earth. It's a real event, historical, actually took place, but it's typological of the future judgment that is to come. So also the ark, a real, actual, literal ark, saved Noah and his family, but that's typological of how God is going to save his elect people in the gospel through Jesus Christ. And so on throughout the Old Testament, we see dozens and dozens of these types. Isaac was a type, a son of his father who was willing to go to be sacrificed. The ram in the same passage, which comes out as a sacrifice instead of Isaac, is a type of Christ, and that Christ will die in place of his people so that they don't have to die. All of the sacrifices in the Old Testament, the tabernacle, the temple, these are typological of the fuller gospel sacrifice that Jesus will make. This is in large measure the very point of the book of Hebrews. By the way, if you read through Hebrews, it's constantly pulling out the types, showing the greater significance in Christ. The high priest was a type of the greater high priest who is Jesus. The serpents, remember the bronze serpents in the wilderness, is a type of Christ, even as Christ is held up for us on the cross and brings a greater healing. And on it goes throughout the Old Testament. We see these typological actual persons, places, and events that are fulfilled or point to a greater significance than it itself. And so here's what I would do with Nebuchadnezzar, or the day star in Isaiah chapter 14. I would suggest to you that literally this passage refers to the actual king of Babylon, probably Nebuchadnezzar, but that it has typological significance of the fall and the damning power that pride has to send us to hell in judgment. And that damning power of pride extends even to mankind made in the image of God. And I would go even further, like Edwards, and connect here and say, even the devil himself, if he becomes proud of his own glory, he, like the planet Venus, the day star, will find that his time is short and he will be overwhelmed by one who is greater than itself, bringing the judgment of pride, the judgment of ego, the judgment of self-aggrandizement against himself and us too if we're not careful. All right, so there you go. There's a kind of a fuller interpretation of this passage than maybe I meant to give originally, but I hope that was somewhat helpful to you as you think through this passage. And the next time you get to your study Bible or your Bible study group and somebody points to this as explicitly related to the fall of Satan, you can say, but wait a minute, we need to go to the Latin and to the Hebrew as well to get to the bottom of this. Well, thank you so much for checking into this YouTube Bible study. I do love you lots. Hope you find some other things that are beneficial on this channel. And that's it for now. Talk to you later. Thanks for checking in.